Herzlich willkommen zum On the Way to New Work Podcast. Heute ohne Michael. Ich bin wieder spontan bei der IO Unlimited und habe mir einen der Speaker geschnappt. Und wir machen gerade einen Spaziergang durch Planten und Blumen. And now I switch to English because my guest is Professor Dr. Andrew Huberman. Is that
Huberman?
Huberman. That's how you would say
the German
it.
pronunciation is the
exactly.
right one.
That's what Peter
right.
said it.
Yeah.
So Andrew, we actually had a long talk already, and we met yesterday. And I said I'm gonna wait for the question who you are and how did you become the person who you are for the podcast, because I wanted to find out from yourself the story, because we just heard this super interesting talk and we will share the insights hopefully in the podcast as well.
First off, thanks so much for having me on. I'm delighted. And especially that we can do this here in beautiful Hamburg. It's so beautiful a city.
Yeah, it's usually not sunny like that.
Well, it's spectacular. So, I'll give the story of how I got into science and how I've become who I am today, which is starts with the earliest story that I can give that's relevant. Is my dad is a theoretical physicist, and he was walking me to school when I was 6. He used to walk me down to about halfway, and then he would leave me there. He would turn left and go off to work in his lab, and I would continue on, and I would go pick up this young lady, and as a gesture of, chivalry, I suppose, and I would we would go to school together. And one day we stopped at our separation point, and I said, I don't know why I said it, but both he and I remember very well. I said, do you like what you do? And he said, I love it. And I said, really? And he said, yeah, the feeling the night before your birthday? I said, yeah. And he said, I feel like that every day.
Whoa.
And I thought, wow, that's really something else. And I said, my response was, I'm going to do what you do. And then I said, what do you do? And he said he was a physicist and he studied how the natural world works. And at that time he was working on chaos theory. It was the early days of chaos theory. And but he said, but you don't want to do what I do. He said, by the time you're old enough to do science, a lot of the great mysteries will be solved. I think you should work on something that has more virgin soil, more untread territory. And I said, like what? And he said, the brain. I think the brain is really interesting, and someday we'll figure it out. And I said, well, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to figure out how the brain works. And so that was the first time I declared it. I had no idea what I was talking about, of course. I've always had an interest in the natural world and in animals and animal behavior in particular. Predator-prey relationships are super interesting to me. The kind of symbiosis between different animals and how they use different types of nervous systems so differently. So like a bird has a nervous system that's fundamentally different from that of a cat, except for at the deeper levels of controlling heart and breathing and things like that. They use that machinery so differently, and they have very different machinery. And so I've always been intrigued in how humans fit into that picture. What is the machinery in our heads and also body design that allows us to do all the incredible things that we can do? And so that was kind of the early seed of it. Now, there's another component to the story which was unpredicted, and looking back, I suppose it was a good set of circumstances, but at the time was not as convenient or prescient or predictive of becoming a scientist, which was when I had a pretty standard childhood. We ate dinner together every night. This was all pre-internet. And so, it was a reasonably healthy, happy home. And then when I turned 13, 14, my parents divorced, and it was a very high conflict divorce. Just like one of these situations where everyone did the best they could, but it just turned into a very bad situation. So my dad moved out and away. My mom was at home and dealing with her own set of struggles around that. And I pretty quickly stopped going to school in any kind of disciplined way. I was very interested at the time and involved in the skateboarding and punk rock community. Like very early on, I decided, even though I grew up playing sports like swimming and soccer, I had a bunch of friends that started skateboarding in the mid 80s, and then a lot of them quit when high school rolled around, and I just kept going. A good friend of mine became a professional skateboarder. I was like fully into that world. I loved it. I wasn't that good, to be honest. I didn't have the physicality. I was getting hurt a lot. I just didn't perform that well. But it's kind of interesting. A lot of the guys that I grew up with and knew back then went on to become professional skateboarders. Some of them, however, in that group became drug addicts. A couple went schizophrenic. There's a suicide or few in the bunch. A lot of suffering, this kind of thing. So, but I got a pretty fast streetwise education during my high school years. I wasn't going to school much at all. I was skateboarding. I was not a good student. I barely finished high school, and I was really struggling to figure things out. But what happened was, at some point, I was actually removed from school, and as a condition for being let back in, I had to do weekly therapy. That was the only way they were going to let me do it. So I started working with a therapist really young, who, because of the conditions in my home and the way things were going, I didn't actually have. There wasn't a lot of parental oversight, let's say. And so he wasn't an official guardian, but I really kind of turned over a lot of parenting roles to him. And it was a boundaried professional relationship. But and he gave me a book on meditation. It was actually Jon Kabat-Zinn's book, Wherever You Go, There You Are. Still a very powerful read and an important book, I think. And Kabat-Zinn, I think, is a real pioneer in that sense. He's a medical physician and was also thinking about mindfulness. So I highly recommend that book for anyone. It's a short book, but really good. And I started, so now I was like doing some meditation, I was going to therapy, I was trying to get my life together, but I was still a pretty poor student. Eventually, I realized I really like physical challenge. So I started getting into running, martial arts, Muay Thai boxing. And I started, so there I was like doing some reading, doing some fighting. I had a girlfriend at the time, and the story basically is that I've realized I was gonna need to do something to make a living, and I didn't know what I was going to do. It didn't look like I was going to graduate high school. So, which in the States can be, except in rare circumstances, can really hold you back quite a lot. We hear about these people like dropped out of college and started big companies, but the truth is they got into those colleges first. And they were doing quite well, which is why they left. So I was really looking for something, and I had this intensity, but I didn't know what to do. So I decided I was going to become a firefighter. So I started taking classes in fire science. And then what happened was the girlfriend went off to college, to university, and she was a year ahead of me, and I basically just moved down there and lived in my car in the parking lot outside her dormitory. I wasn't about to, she was kind of like my family at that point. I still wasn't really that close with my family. And I moved down there. I was getting into a lot of fights. I really had a lot of kind of behavioral issues going on, still a lot of anger. I was just really not looking anything like a future scientist at that point. And what happened was, I ended up once it was 4th of July 1994, I actually got into a very serious physical altercation with a bunch of guys. And it was after that I realized, okay, I'm like 18 years old now, I was 18. I'm getting into fights, I'm living in some random squat, I'm not doing much of anything, I'm working these jobs, like I'm in, I realized I was like, I'm in trouble, I'm in real trouble. And because at some point the story was just going to keep going this direction, and there was just nothing was going anywhere. And I started to realize that whatever had happened, whatever kind of family challenges that I'd had, I wasn't going to become a professional skateboarder. I'd kind of separated from those friends. I was not a particularly talented athlete. I just realized I got to do something. This is just, I think I was scared, honestly. I think I sort of hit my rock bottom. And I was lucky that drugs and alcohol were never really my thing, but I didn't know what to do with myself. So I decided to move home and enroll in some university courses there. But I decided at that point also that I would get very serious about fitness and learning. And so I just started doing a lot of running, a lot of weight training. I learned everything I could about the mind and body. I would go into the bookstores and just read everything I could about fitness, about psychology. And I decided to take psychology classes. So I took a psychology class, and then eventually I went back to university. I lived alone at that point, and I took a class on abnormal psychology.
What is that?
Which is like, now they would never get away with calling it that, but it was basically about schizophrenia, depression, disorders of the nervous system, everything to Parkinson's disease, these kinds of things. And I was just fascinated because the guy teaching the class, his name was Harry Carlisle, who was a professor, was telling me about all these mechanisms in the brain and body, neurotransmitters and hormones and all these kinds of things that were disrupted in these diseases that I think I had seen a lot of. I saw a lot of depression. I saw a lot of, having a friend commit suicide. I had friends, who were addicts. I was always fascinated by how some people just do really well just drinking on the weekends, and other people become alcoholics. Like, why? It didn't make any sense. And it couldn't have just been life circumstances. So a light bulb went on. I was like, I'm gonna do this. I wanna work on this. I want to understand the mind. Because I'd gone through my own thing of having been the kind of normal kid, happy, healthy childhood, then everything just kind of fell apart. I was depressed, but I was also angry. I was seeking, but and I was like, I want to figure this out. And he must have seen something in me, because that professor said, hey, you should come work in my lab. So I joined his lab and we started doing science together. And I really took to him. Throughout my career, if there's anything that I can really recommend to people, regardless of age, is that, finding a good mentor. And mentors change over time. Actually, one of the best books I ever read is Robert Greene's book, Mastery. Greene is the author. And in Mastery, he talks about like apprenticing yourself to people repeatedly, and that changes over time. There's a natural actual breaking up between the mentor and mentee that happens. And so I just sort of apprenticed myself to this guy. I don't know if he wanted me to or not, but I started working in his lab, doing experiments. We were trying to understand at that time how MDMA, ecstasy, impacts temperature regulation. So it was kind of fun to go to parties and tell people I was working on ecstasy. We were trying to figure out why people were dying from taking it from overheating, but that's a different story. And I loved it. I loved doing neuroanatomy. I loved working with my hands. I loved the camaraderie of working with lab mates. And I'd grown up and I felt saved during high school by the camaraderie that was the skateboarding and punk rock community. And then, because I had no musical talent or skateboarding talent, those guys all kind of moved on and did their own thing. And now it's funny, I've reconnected with a lot of them because the 90s are kind of coming back. It's another tangent we could take, but I love the camaraderie. Like, I loved getting in a van and going places. I loved being surrounded by a pack of guys. It was mostly guys, and just going and having adventures. I love adventure. And I realized that science was for me because the adventure never ends. You get conclusions along the way, but there's always that anticipation and that excitement. And I'm smiling because in many ways that's what I realize that just now in this moment, that's what my dad was talking about. It's like, it's that novelty seeking, and it's there, and you just need to untease it. Just need to find it. You're trying to peel things back in layers. You go too fast and you screw up. So it taught me patience. I always say, the big difference between scientists and other people on the planet is that when a scientist sees something that excites them, they slow down, because they know that in speeding up is where you make errors of judgment, errors of motor errors. And so I fell in love with it. And there wasn't even a field of neuroscience back then. So eventually it came to be called neuroscience. And I was getting good grades, and I went from I don't know, can I swear on this podcast?
Everything.
University professor, I probably should do that, but I was a shit student, and I became a straight A A+ student as best I could, just through hard work. I used to sit in my room, read my textbooks, and just rewrite them, memorize them. I used to close my eyes and memorize them. I'd listen to my records and CDs back then, and it was like I just alternate. I'd listen to like Rancid, Bob Dylan, just keep going back and forth and studying until 3 a.m. or whatever, sleep till 10. It was college years. And I realized I had a pretty good memory, and I had a knack for it, and I was decent enough with my hands that I could do experiments in the lab. Wasn't the best surgeon, but I wasn't the worst either. And I was like, wow, I think this is it. And that guy Harry Carlisle, he said, you should consider going to graduate school. You seem to really like this stuff, and they'll pay you. And I was like, wow, so cool, they'll pay me. So now I had a direction. And at that point, I just was it. I was on fire, you know. I was like, that's it. I'm going to get my PhD by the time I'm 30. I'm going to get a faculty position by the time I'm 35. I want tenure at a major university by the time I'm 40. And that just became my singular goal, and a singular set of goals, I should say. And I loved it. I've formed great relationships through my scientific career. There's some very interesting people in neuroscience. I was lucky to come up early when it was relatively small. Stanford's a phenomenal place to work, and very forward thinking. People are very collegial. You hear a lot of bad things about science, how hard it is and competitive it is, and I was like, great, make it harder, make it more competitive. I just leaned into the whole thing really hard, and I always worked with nice people who I also enjoy as human beings. And so, I've just kept at it. And then as part of this new direction that my lab has been taking and thinking about stress and thinking about high performance, and also this kind of new life of speaking with the general public and working on books and trying to interface with the public more around science, that is a kind of new outgrowth of my scientific career. But it roots back to the early story, because I have this weird karma around mentors. So I've had 3 of the most spectacular mentors ever. They were kind, they pushed me, they were tough when they need to be tough, they were great people. But I had this weird experience where Harry Carlisle, greatest university lecturer, teacher ever, I can credit him with, being, in the career I am today. When I was in graduate school, I'd left his lab, moved on, and I'd published a paper in Science, which is like a big win for us. It's a tough journal. And I emailed him and said, hey, got this paper. I want to make him proud. And he said, oh, that's great. I'm really happy for you, and would be great to see you next time you're down here. And then 2 weeks later, he blew his head off in the bathtub. And I was like, oh, wow. Which was, for me, was just devastating. It's just because he was the figure he was, but also I think it's because it didn't make sense, right? This is the guy that taught me about all this, brain mechanisms, but I learned that no matter how good we get at understanding things, we all still have these limitations that keep us from really, seeing our blind spots or something. I don't even know the language around it. It was tragic, right? But then what happened was I had an amazing graduate advisor and an amazing postdoc advisor. And so I don't know what to make of this, but what eventually ended up happening is I had a good career as a graduate student, good career as a postdoc, but both my graduate advisor and my postdoc got very ill and died very young. So I've seen a lot of people go, and I didn't think we were going to start the conversation off this way, but I think that it's interesting. I think a lot these days about grief, and all the stuff that you hear about trauma and stress. And I realize, humans need help. That humans need help. We're really good at figuring things out. We're really good at outsourcing. We're really good at rapid progress. But I realize that, a significant contribution that my lab could make would be to devote a significant amount of our time and resources to understanding what is stress, how does it work, it's apparent in all these mental diseases, depression, anxiety. What is it? It's not always bad. Stress, you grow from it too. So I decided to convert a lot of my lab to understanding that, and I've started developing ties and connections to people in the psychiatry department at Stanford, and in the psychiatric community, in the addiction community, and the trauma release community, in efforts to try and understand what tools are available to people out there, what are people doing, how can my lab contribute. And so that's brought us into the worlds now of trying to understand how respiration physiology and visual neuroscience might be leveraged to help relieve suffering. So the joke is, you don't want me to work for you. And I can have that I can make a little slightly morbid joke about that, because all my advisors are dead. And they all would have probably had a good chuckle about that one, I like to think. And at the same time, I'm blessed, there's no other word for it. I've been very blessed to work with these amazing people. And so I just made the decision. So all this converges on 3 points. One is, I'm fascinated by the brain, what it can do and how it fails. I'm struck by the human being's ability to do such incredible things, and also to create such distorted perceptions of ourselves and others that we can do so much harm to one another and to ourselves. It doesn't make any sense, but there must be a reason. And then that brings me to the third point, which is that I'm absolutely obsessed with trying to find solutions to those problems. And I think that feels like my calling at this point, to leverage the understanding about the brain and neuroscience, to leverage an understanding of what it really is to be in those states and to be close to people in those states. I don't look at neuroscience from the standpoint of being at an elite university. Of course, Stanford is a wonderful place to work and very elite, but I look at it as, how can what I do in my lab benefit the greatest number of people and before I'm gone? Because one thing is certain, is that at some point the reaper's coming for me, hopefully later. I haven't been shark diving much these days, so hopefully later, and not sooner. And what can I do about that problem? And when I go, I want to leave behind tools. I want to leave not ideas, not inspiration necessarily. People get that, great, but tools, like real tools that people can use when they're down, when they're like confused, when they're in a state of lack of focus and they need to focus, when they're stressed, when they I want to attack those problems. And so that's how I'm showing up these days.
Oh, that's
so anyway, long answer to your question, but that's the story. And there are parts of it I wish I were making up, because there's been a lot of misfortune in there, but there's been so much more beauty and good fortune. Every day I feel really lucky to do what I do.
That's a full picture. Thank you for sharing that. That open.
Yeah. I have, there it is.
A million questions that come to my mind, and we definitely need to talk about the tools, and we make a video about the tools to share the breathing techniques, because that showed me. But let me ask you, because that felt like this is the question you have, what is the reason that we make us suffer? I mean, there are people who are sad about their work and don't like to go there, but still go there. There are people who are stressed about their private situation, but still stay there with a certain grit in their mind and repeat these things. And that really resonated with me, saying okay, you talked about therapy, you talked about tools, you talked about all these things, but you're a scientist, so you want the facts.
Right.
Is there any indication you see what that could be good for? Could it be good for growing? Do we need that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I actually think that stress, and when I look at something like stress or suffering, I look at it from the standpoint of what's the underlying physiology, and what could this be good for, right? This isn't a recent evolution. People have been feeling these ways for thousands of years. And so if you think about stress in the following way, it might start to make some sense. So first of all, if you're very hungry, you haven't eaten in a long time, you start to feel agitated, it's stressful, and your focus will be on food. And nature designed you that way to go seek food. So this arousal or stress that we're accustomed to calling it, stress, was designed to leverage you towards certain behaviors and away from others. After you eat a big meal, you're sated, you're fine to relax, and in fact you naturally relax. Nature designed you that way too. Loneliness is a really interesting example where people feel so miserable, but that misery was designed to get you to go find social connection and mates. Somehow in our modern thinking about these states, we've come to the idea that if you're in a lonely state, it makes you less able or less willing to go seek out connection. But that's a violation of why it was created in the first place. It was created to we are naturally supposed to move away from feelings of discomfort toward things that bring us comfort. And that, you have to be selective in what you choose for comfort, because you don't want to choose things that can be destructive. But I really see stress and loneliness and discomfort, like the not feeling good about a job or a situation, as very strong signals that something needs to change. And I see more misery around people remaining in situations that are not making them happy or fulfilled, because happiness is a tricky one. I think fulfillment is really what it's about. I'm not happy every day, but I'm very fulfilled by my work. It has what other people have referred to as meaning. It feels important. It feels like the right thing for my life. Now, I think, but there have been times when I've been in the wrong place or the wrong state or the wrong job and I needed to move. And I think that we are always dealing with, as humans, these two competing forces between disrupting people's sense of us. We like people to see us, and so much of our own recognition comes through how we perceive other people perceive us, right? Our ideas about how others perceive us. For a lot of people, that really defines their self-perception and sometimes even their self-worth. But to the extent that you're unhappy doing something, that's a signal. I'll use an example actually that I think about a lot lately, which some of your listeners or viewers may resonate with, which is grief. So after my third advisor died, and I can say this with a smile because I've just, at some point it almost became kind of humorous. I was like, this is crazy, right? I started thinking about grief. I was reading a book by Richard Feynman, the great, surely you're joking, Mr. Feynman, the physicist. And he was amazing. His first wife died very young and of tuberculosis. And when he eventually passed away many years later, they went to his office and they discovered tons and tons of handwritten letters that he had written to her every day. It's incredible. Like he just, but he described in his book that she died and he didn't really experience much grief at first. But then one day he was walking by a shop and he saw a dress in the window. And he thought, and forgive me because I forget her name, but he said, oh, she would love that. And then it hit him all at once. And it was in that story that I realized something very powerful, which is that grief is literally, and this isn't just an attempt to intellectualize something, that grief is literally the passage of an idea of someone or something from actionable to inactionable. So let's say you love your sunglasses and someone takes them or you lose them. There's kind of a little mini grief around that for a few days. Like you'll get over it, but it's hard. It takes a couple days. You can't immediately just say like, oh, I don't care, right? I don't care how mindful you are. It's kind of painful because they're no longer there for you. Now you'd say, well, why would you create this emotion, this state that seems so crippling, like where it collapses you? Well, if you think about it in kind of evolutionary or adaptive terms, if somebody died and there's a body, one of the worst things you can do from a health standpoint and evolution standpoint is to continue to interact with the body, because bodies decompose and they carry all sorts of things that are bad. So grief is designed, perhaps, this is a hypothesis, to get us to move away from things that are not good for us in order to no longer act on them, right? To put the body in the ground. And so much of the grieving process I've just noticed in myself and in other people is about it's hard. Every time I walk by my colleague's office and he's not there, it's painful. But I'm not trying to act on going to see him, it's just, he's just as much present in my memory as he was the days he was alive. These things like grief and anxiety and suffering, they were designed to pivot us in new directions. I really fundamentally believe that. I don't think there's anything in our nervous system that's extra. I don't think we have the equivalent of like the appendix of the brain. And I don't think it's because of the modern times that we're living that we're suffering more. I think that people have always suffered in these ways. So I look at grief as a process that's going to take some time to move these ideas about who's actionable and what's actionable into the past. And that's why I can talk about these people with, I still have emotion, but it's more of joy that I got to know them than sadness. Now, there's an interesting kind of corollary to this, which is very different, which I'll just mention, and it might come as a little shocking when I first say it, but it illustrates an important principle about how the brain is built and works, which is fetishes. So this is not something I work on, nor is it something that I'm involved in, but it's very interesting when you look at the sensation of taste. You have receptors for bitter, and you have receptors for sweet. You also have receptors for sour and other things, of course, too. But in general, things that are sweet are things that we're willing to interact with and ingest, and things that are bitter are things that kind of evoke a repulsion because it was evolutionarily wired that way, so bitter things tend to be poisonous. It's a good, as they say, heuristic or shorthand for avoiding poisonous things. Now, it's very interesting that people develop these things we call fetishes, which are but they don't develop them to park benches or to leaves. They're almost always to things that evolutionarily are actually quite hazardous, right? Things that are infectious, right? Things that are dangerous. So in that way, even though I pass no judgment on human beings' behavior, I'm not a psychologist, I'm in no place to, it's interesting to think that like the things that we look at in society as kind of like bad tend to have a kind of a punishment of outcome in an evolutionary sense, right? I mean, incest leads to mutations, and almost everybody believes that that's bad. There's this kind of sensation of disgust around it, which is selected for, right? Because of the mutations that occur when people that are too close of kin have offspring. And in the same way, interacting with things that are potentially infectious is disgusting to many people, right? So when there's this kind of crossover that people talk about of, sexual appetites and things that are dangerous, we kind of have a reaction, right? And so it's not by chance. The nervous system organizes the world into things you approach, things you're neutral about, and things you avoid. And so to pull this all around to your question, if you're waking up every day and thinking like, this job is not for me, you're obviously not saying that. This is clearly the job for you and your other endeavors. You seem quite happy. But when people are waking up and they're like, this isn't good, these are mild forms of your nervous system telling you, you need to move away from this. Loneliness, you need to move towards social connection, right? Putrid smell, you need to move away from it, right? Grief, you need to move away from trying to act on this physical body that's no longer here, that's dead. And you need to move, it's okay to maintain the memory, but you need to then move on. And so I look at the nervous system and the brain as a very, very smart, very sophisticated device that actually is doing fairly simple categorization of its environment. And so this is why I think the resurgence of the movement about like, the gut has a brain and the heart has a brain. I'm gonna be really honest. I don't wanna burst anybody's bubble, but there is no brain in your stomach. There is no brain in your heart. It's called the nervous system. Your brain is connected to the rest of your body and your body's connected to your brain. There is no brain-body distinction. There's no mind-body distinction. That's kind of like 1970s, right? The excitement is that people are starting to realize, sometimes these sensations that I feel might actually be signals to do things. And so I like to point out the extremes of, so I mentioned grief and fetishes and all these things, not because I like to activate people, but because I think they are the primordial forms of these mechanisms that were wired into us. And so they kind of inform the more subtle cues about what those subtle cues might mean. Does that make sense?
Definitely. Okay. And that's again a full picture answer with a lot of stuff to think about. And when I'm now like, the question I'm having, or that's right now on my mind, is around again these situations when you think, okay, I can't, and I still have to like reflect on that, because there are a lot of sensations going on, and sometimes I think we unlearned to like detect them. So we find convenient ways to like make it nice, like we get more money and then it's okay for a while and stuff like that. So we kind of put it away. But let's say you get into extreme situations and you don't want to react right away. You're stressed out, you're panicking and stuff like that. And you were giving that experiment with the mice. And you also do that to humans, you said. So maybe you can reflect on that a little bit and say, okay, that's the situation, that's what we saw with the mice. And I love what you did with the humans and the diving and the sharks. You definitely need to share that. Yeah,
so in my lab we work on mice because you can do exploratory types of experiments in mice that can inform where to look in humans or things you could do in humans. And I should just briefly mention, I love animals, I have tremendous respect for animals. It's just the reality that certain experiments can be done on mice that you can't do on other species. And but we also work on humans. And so my lab is interested in how our internal states of, you could call it stress, but kind of states of alertness or arousal or stress interact with what we perceive in order to drive our decision making and our behavior. So we had a discovery a couple years ago published in Nature in 2018 where we basically gave mice a visual image that scared them. They thought it was a hawk coming to eat them, and they either freeze or they run. Usually they just freeze. But we found a brain area that when we stimulate it, could convert the freezing response to a confrontational response. The mice became more willing to lean into the stress. And the cool thing was the mice actually really like that sensation. It wasn't the kind of stress of like being panicked. It was a stress of, it was associated with a kind of reward, dopamine reward. And we decided to explore the same thing in humans. So we also have the equivalent laboratory in humans where we scare and stress humans at anywhere from mild to severe, depending on the person, using virtual reality. And I've gone out personally and helped record some of this virtual reality. We look at things like heights, public speaking, these kinds of cognitive tasks under stressful conditions, as well as diving with great white sharks. I figure a lot of people are afraid of sharks, spiders, those kinds of things. And I have a good friend who's a professional shark diver, Michael Muller, is a famous photographer who also does a lot of cage exit shark diving. Not something to go do on your own. There's a certain set of skills required to not get eaten. But we would go out to Guadalupe, Mexico. I've been out there twice now. You take boats out there. It's about 22 hours. Drop cages in the water. One cage at the surface, one cage 40 feet below. You're on scuba down below. And then we got permits from the Mexican government to cage exit. It's actually illegal to do, but we got permits because we were doing some research with it. And it turns out the way to not get eaten by a great white shark is to swim at them. So they come in lumbering in groups of 1 to 3, and they line you up, and you're tracking them. And what's really interesting is as soon as you're watching one for a little while, you'll remember to look down and you'll see another one's coming. It's coming to pick you off. It's going to put you in its mouth. And they are very large, very fast, very agile in the water, but also very curious animals. And so we went down there and filmed a VR experience of that. So if you come to my lab to be a subject, can I plug the lab? We actually pay you, so it's not a for-profit.
You can do that, definitely.
So unfortunately, you have to actually come to the lab. We can't do this remotely, but if you come to my lab, you can experience all this in virtual reality while we measure your breathing, your heart rate, your pupil size, different aspects of stress response. And then we also teach some interventions for stress that I'll talk about in a few minutes. We pay you a nominal amount. I think it's like $40 US, and parking pass, can give you a t-shirt, this kind of thing.
That's decent for
a
shark
it's not too bad. It's a lot of fun. It takes about 2 hours. You can find us, just send me a DM at Huberman Lab is my Instagram. Incidentally, I also do these daily neuroscience posts on Instagram. We can talk about that later.
Yeah, definitely.
But anyway, that's how you get a hold of us if you want it. We'd love to have you as a subject. We look at people who have generalized anxiety and so-called typicals, or who don't. And we've learned a lot from that. We've learned that patterns of breathing and vision change dramatically under conditions of stress, not surprisingly, but also that breathing and vision can be used as interventions for stress. The sharks are just one aspect of that. And that also kind of ties into, I have this interest in, I've tried to have as much, get as much information as I could from people who are very good at navigating high stress, high uncertainty environments, people in, elite military, people, shark diving community, climbers and so forth, because I think there's a lot to be learned from people that are very good at dynamically controlling their stress level. You don't want to be somebody who's always disengaged. You don't want to be somebody who's always hyper-focused. You want to be able to engage and disengage as necessary for the tasks that you go through. So the tools that I've been working on, and these are still tools in progress, involve both breathing, respiration, and use of the visual system. And should we talk about those?
Definitely, yeah.
So, there's a lot of interest nowadays in breath work. The great Wim Hof, obviously, is popularized.
Oh, he's coming tomorrow.
Yeah, it's coming tomorrow. And breath work is a very powerful way for people to get acquainted with their kind of internal workings and nervous system, and the fact that they have some degree of control over their nervous system. So, mindfulness meditation is wonderful, and I've been doing it for years and still get a tremendous amount of benefit from it. But it takes a long time for most people to kind of get disciplined about it and to really extract the power of it. And so respiration, for many people, not all, is a quicker route into understanding this notion of autonomic control. Autonomic just means automatic, and it's kind of a misnomer because you can actually control it. But for instance, a few years ago, I decided to start looking at what are the breathwork practices out there? What are people doing? And really trying to extract principles from them so that we could distill it down to things that are really straightforward. So I'll just throw out a few of those because it would take a few hours to go into all of them.
People in the car could do that, right?
People in the car could do it. That's right.
Good.
And I'm not withholding, but I'm working on a book about the vision and breathing tools as well as some other tools. Should be out in 2020, but right now, here are some things that I think could be helpful to most people. Breathing through your nose allows you to remove carbon dioxide well. And a lot of people find that by restricting themselves to nasal breathing, unless they're eating or talking, they can feel calmer and better. Just simple. Now, the reason for that is that the nose, for many people, is a better way to get rid of carbon dioxide. Now, you breathe because you need carbon dioxide. People think you breathe to get oxygen, and you do, but the brain senses carbon dioxide levels going up, and that causes the breath reflex. This is how free divers stay underwater a very long time. They train themselves to let out their carbon dioxide slowly while staying calm. Very dangerous sport. Talk to somebody who really knows what they're doing before you get involved in that sport, or just don't do it at all. But for most of us, and for those of us above water, because you don't want to do breath work near water, the simple behavior of restricting your breathing to nasal breathing most of the time can be immensely beneficial. And in fact, there were 2 papers published in very good journals, neuroscience journals, looking at the effects of nasal versus mouth breathing on learning and memory, and enhanced learning and memory. And these are good studies, not done by my lab, done by other groups. And not just memories for odors, which people always say, because one of them was, but also memories for other things. So nasal breathing is a good tool. The other thing is that oftentimes we're told when we get stressed, just take a deep breath. But actually, that's the wrong thing to do. What you want to do when you're stressed is to take a long exhale. You want to get rid of carbon dioxide. A lot of the stress response is because of a failure to adequately regulate carbon dioxide. Best example of this is I can put you in a small box or elevator and start slowly removing the oxygen flow to the point where there's just enough. And if you're breathing too fast, you're actually not blowing off carbon dioxide, because by breathing fast, you're taking in air, but you're not getting rid of a lot of the carbon dioxide. So long exhales can calm you. And a lot of people just report immediate relief in taking this long exhale, in particular long nasal exhales. Okay. The other thing that can be quite good is understanding that the opposite is also true, that if you inhale more than you exhale, generally the tendency is for your level of alertness or autonomic arousal to go up. This is why when you go to Las Vegas, Nevada, you go into a casino, you were kind of tired, you were up all night, and all of a sudden you're alert, you feel good. Now sure, there's social context, there are no clocks and things, but they're pumping the air full of oxygen.
Exactly.
Makes sense, right? So this is why, cyclists and other people, if you get knocked out, one of the first things they do, the ambulance shows up, the medic shows up, and they put an oxygen mask on you. This is just basic physiology, but we've kind of forgotten it in our attempt to create these tools for improving ourselves, that more oxygen in, you're going to tend to be more alert. Blowing off carbon dioxide by long exhales, in particular long nasal exhales, can be very, very powerful. And tools like Wim Hof breathing, I don't know if you'll get a chance to interview Wim Hof, but if you can, great. If not, his tools generally involve doing a combination of high oxygenated breathing and some breath holds. The breath holds start getting into some nuance and a little more complicated around breathing. But one tool that I think is really great was created by a former Navy SEAL by the name of Mark Devine. Devine, who lives in Encinitas, and he calls box breathing, which is inhale for a certain duration, like anywhere from 2 to 5 seconds. Inhale, hold, exhale, hold. So it's like a box, and of equal duration. So it might be inhale for 3, hold for 3, exhale for 3, hold for 3, and repeat that. And people always say, well, how long? Well, Mark would probably say that that's a good practice to do any time for a few minutes, but that you can actually do that while you're engaging in behavior, as long as you're not talking, right? So box breathing tends to keep people in kind of a balanced ratio of oxygen and carbon dioxide, such that your alertness is there, your focus is there. It's not going to make you particularly sleepy or particularly alert. It's kind of that nice, even plane of focus for doing work. Credit to Mark for that. One of the first people that I'm aware of that started coming up with really specific breathing protocols that could tell you exactly how to do it. But all this boils down again to some very just natural biology of our nervous system, which is when we're relieved or tired, we tend to what? We sigh. It's relaxing. The whole body follows the exhale response. When we're startled or we're shocked, we inhale. in preparation, in preparation to get the body mobilized to go do something. I'm going to cough for a second. Excuse me.
Okay.
Excuse me. I am not breathing enough. So respiration or breathing is a very powerful way to modify your state of internal levels of stress. And it's completely free, available at all times, unless you're in water. Breath work in water it can be a very dangerous relationship. So I don't recommend doing it at all near water or before going into water. And then the more extreme forms of breath work, like breath work release work for trauma release, those are generally best done with a practitioner, but those generally involve going into high oxygenated states and getting people comfortable in stressful states. So everything I've said so far is kind of about, well, if you don't feel good about something, you should move away from it, But there's also the other reality, which is sometimes there's kind of pain in growth, right? There's this sort of strain. I remember learning in my textbooks and being so confused. I mean, for a kid that didn't go to school very much, to then be faced with all these like science and chemistry courses, I was just making up so much lost territory that I had to really strain. I mean, it felt like lifting heavy weights. Excuse me. Let me catch my breath a moment.
No worry.
So, there we go. So the strain and pain of studying or the strain and pain of exercise and these kinds of things, we know we grow from that, we adapt. So one has to find that place, that really important distinction between what is a message that is very clear to move away from something, that it's bad, and what is a message to move towards something. And this, I think, is actually one of the most fundamental questions that anyone can ask themselves, because ultimately there will be a tremendous amount of information out there and inspiration and ideas for how when we lean into stress, we can grow. I mean, there's so many great examples, right? And, Alex Honnold, climbing, El Cap without ropes, David Goggins running and pushing himself the way he does. I mean, Wim and what he does. I mean, there's this question, right? When do you trust your thoughts about, no, that's just not for me, too painful, too hard, just not interested? And when do you say, wait, I'm not leaning into life the way that I should. I need to move through it. That's a fundamental question that everyone has to answer for themselves. And it gets to very important and kind of bigger questions about meaning, because I'll be the last person to say that you should just do something because it's difficult. But I also know, like in the last year, for instance, I've gotten really into a friend of mine, also former SEAL team guy. I wasn't in the SEAL teams, but he was. Just so when I say also, I mean, in addition to David and some of these other folks, it's got me really into doing long open water, no wetsuit swims in Southern California. It's quite cold. It's early in the morning, anywhere from 1 to 5 mile swims. These are very long swims, for me anyway. And I feel like I've grown tremendously as a human being from doing those, but from pushing myself. Now I love them. I look forward to them. I enjoy it. If last year you had said, hey, how do you feel about getting into cold water at 6:30 in the morning without a wetsuit and swimming for a couple miles? I'm like, I don't know about why, but now I understand why. So there's growth there. I've had great insights during those swims. I love the camaraderie. I realize I can do things I didn't think I could do. There's a lot of carryover into other aspects of my life. I care about the friendship. So one has to really ask the question, is this going to grow me? That's the question. Is this going to grow me? And so for me, like KJX at shark diving could have killed me, but I decided this is going to grow me. It's going to make me a better person, and the tools I'm going to bring back to the lab will be in service to humanity. So that's the key question. Otherwise, we would all just default towards what feels good.
Yeah.
So it's a hard question to answer, and it can only be answered on an individual basis.
You know what just strikes me is we had a podcast 100. I told you of the guy Fridtjof Bergmann who came up with the name New Work. And I'm trying to connecting a lot of thoughts here right now, which is great. You spark a lot of interesting stuff in my mind right now. But let's say there is a situation and you either, like the mice, you freeze, or you like run away, or you fight, but in a panic mode, not in a good mode, more in a distraction mode. So let's say you have a tool that can help you to then, like the breathing, for example, to stay in the situation, to make this decision and listen to your then inner voice, like as you said, awake or like alert, but at the same time calm, to make a proper decision. Is that something how it could work? Because what Fridtjof said, for example, in your work and like trying to find out what you really, really want to do in your life, and this can like relate to a work situation, but also to a personal situation. He said, it's not about pleasure. Pleasure, you get it everywhere.
Sure.
That's easy. It's about this question, what do you really want to do?
Yeah.
And this can include stepping out of the comfort zone and like doing the swim, staying in a situation, work on yourself. I mean, how difficult can a relationship be? Super difficult, as you said, and it can be harmful to many people. And then the question is, do I walk away in that moment when I say, that's my moment to walk away? Do I stay in the situation? Same with the job.
It's a very, it's not just a serious question. I think it's the most important question that anyone can learn to answer for themselves. I really believe this, because I think so much of life is about, at one point I had to decide, look, I'm going to quit being a loser. I was a loser, right? I mean, the fact of the matter was I was getting in fights. I wasn't making much money. I was just like going, but then school was hard work. And at any moment I could have just said it's too much work. But I set a goal, and I was just determined. And it was kind of survival mode for me at that point, because I knew what it was like to be really down and out, and I just was never going to go there again. Incidentally, whenever you say or I say the words, I'm never going to go there again, you find yourself there again, but in some new form. And that's just nature's diabolical trick of making sure that you never get too sure of yourself. But that's good. What you learn in the process of transformation, of like going from through a challenge, is you learn how to move through challenge. I think that's why early on, I think it's good to move through challenge, and at any stage of your life, it's good to move through it, because that process can be exported to the new job, to the new relationship. The idea that you're going to leave a relationship and the next one's going to be easy is a fallacy. Like it could be easier, but hopefully you're going to export what you learned. So I think there's a rational answer, or there's a set of principles that one could apply to answer the question better, perhaps. And I think it has to do with the perception of time. So this was sparked by a conversation with a good friend of mine who also happens to be doing incredible work on trauma release and healing. He's in Florida. His name is Ryan Suave, S-O-A-V-E, and he's a very quiet and understated guy, but he's helped a number of people, addicts and people in high performance and stuff, move through some mental blocks. I've seen him do incredible work at this addiction treatment center with other folks. I just went there to observe what he does. And he said something to me once, which was really incredible. He said, because he's used to seeing people like in a state of rage or can't handle anything, you can handle, so I'll just ask you this. So you can handle a feeling of sadness for 1 second, right? Extreme sadness for 1 second. So why not 10 seconds? So why not 20? Why not an hour? What is it that collapses people? It's like the same thing for an addict, they why can't they handle it? And I think it's because mental illness, addiction, grief, they have this strange property. They make it feel not just that it's happening now, but that it's going to either go on forever or that it's going to come back. I think this is the thing that scares people more than anything. That sure, I'm going to change jobs, but then it's going to be the same thing. Or I'll do it, but I'll fail. Or I'll succeed, but then I'll be unhappy despite having succeeded. So, the circumstances vary, but I think what it relates to, however, is this perception of time. There's something about fear that changes our perception of time, and anxiety that changes our perception of time. So, and it does. There's actually a physiological mechanism whereby if something suddenly enters our environment and we're afraid of it, our attention narrows, and our ability, or the way we start chunking time and processing time, it seems like hard events seem like they go on forever because you're slicing more finely. You're looking at it through through a finer lens. And when things are good, time passes like you don't even notice time passing by. This is what some people refer to as flow, right?
Right.
It's like everything's good and time just passes. You don't even notice the passage of time. The opposite is when you're stressed, you're waiting for a diagnosis, or you're a text that's really critical, or you're just in pain. It feels like it goes on forever. So there's a hint there. So as a scientist, I would say like there's a hint there that something about the contraction and dilation of time perception is what's getting involved, and therefore that's the thing that we should try and understand. And so you say, okay, well, how do we start morphing our perception of time? Well, our states, our internal states, change our perception of time. If you've ever driven someplace you knew where you were going, time kind of passes. You can attend to other things. If you don't know where you're going and you're looking for landmarks, it feels like it takes much longer. And that's because as you search through your environment and tighten your focus, you're chopping up time. Is it there? Is it there? Is it there? Is it there? You're waiting. It's like a metronome. Don't think of time. When we talk about time this way, if people think, oh, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, that's not how I'm referring to it. The brain doesn't think 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock. The brain thinks like a metronome. So it's either you're in a good state, you're out with somebody you really enjoy, you're having a good time, and it's more like, you turn around and you're like, wow, it's 9 o'clock. Oh my God. It's as if the metronome goes really slow, really slow, or so the stress state is the one where it's going tick tock, tick tock, tick tock, tick tock. It's the one that's bringing you to this mode of attention where you're anticipating the next thing, and therefore it feels like it goes on very long. It just means, even though the metronome is moving faster, there are many more of them, more ticks and talks, and so it feels like time is going more slowly, right? Whereas when the metronome goes more slowly, tick tock, that interval timer is going more slowly, and it seems like time goes faster. Okay? So your musicians will understand this. I'm not a musician, but this kind of, because the brain has an interval timer, and so high stress, hard emotions tend to make it feel like things are going really, really slowly, and so every moment is painful. And so the ways to then address these questions about what should I do or how should I treat the situation are to get good at bringing your nervous system into states where you're alert and calm. Because you need the focus, you need the ability to think about the problem. People that continually avoid the problem through alcohol or distraction are in trouble too, right? It's the failure of most relationships where people are stressed about the relationship, they go look for a new one, right? Because thinking about it and the grief that's coming potentially is very hard. But if you can stay calm with those thoughts, calm with the idea of what it would be like to leave the job, what it would be like in the new thing, and not quickly run back into your hole like the mouse in our experiments, like, oh, no, it's just gonna be the same thing all over again. If you can stay out there in the arena mentally, you can do yourself a great service in trying to parse through the thinking about what you really want to do. And this is actually kind of what happens in therapy, where somebody starts pulling on that thread little by little, and you realize in reporting the story, like, oh my goodness, it's all internal. It's all in here. It's not that, like, Tim Ferriss has said this, right, a bunch of times, like, what's the worst that can happen? Or like, what does he call it? I forget. I haven't looked at his stuff in a while, but the sort of like
his fear,
right, the fear thing,
yeah.
right? Like what's the worst that can happen thing? And I think that's kind of what we're talking about a little bit. You start getting into those modes of projecting, but you start speeding up your thinking. It's actually interesting to hear people talk about these things in first hit. They go, yeah, and then I leave, but then what? And they kind of like jump to the end. If this were a story, you're like, you just skipped 50 pages. Yeah. What are you doing? So I think the ability to wade into the water and kind of sort through this stuff, and the moment you start feeling your anxiety going up, learning to calm yourself through maybe long exhale breathing, and being able to calm yourself, then you can start working through a mental process in a way that's much more intelligent and structured, and frankly serves you better. It serves the person better. And so I think that's the key, because what you're really doing is you're changing the time perception. And I am completely dismissive of the idea that just by going and taking some pill or some drug, you're suddenly going to wake up able to, confront the thing differently. I think you might fundamentally change yourself, but not in a way that that serves you in the long run. I think that the ability to, long walks or hikes without cell phones can be very powerful for this, because it forces you to enter a state where you kind of have to ruminate or think about the thing. And we as human beings, we work so hard to avoid that. So I think time perception and the ability to control time perception is one of the power tools that people can use to try and sort through a problem in a very dedicated and kind of trustworthy way. I know one thing for sure, which is that I don't trust the thinking that evolves out of high stress. It usually is the wrong kind of thinking. It's what you're trying, the kind of reactive response.
And I mean, phones are definitely not helpful
Phones are definitely
that area of time perception.
Like, I'm from Silicon Valley, born and raised in Palo Alto, and was there, first Apple store on University Avenue. I love the phone, I use the phone. But here's the problem. You know, normally we would have an interaction like this, and then we would walk, and, you know, 20 years ago, and then we would kind of let our vision expand, and we would walk back. You'd get some relaxation in between things. Now, I think we reflexively, I do this too, so I'm not, you know, immune from this. I would reflexively look at my phone in between meetings, reflexively look at my phone. You go to the women won't know this because they're not in the men's restrooms, but the men's restroom, people are looking at their phone while they're at the urinal. You know, it's amazing, right? It's like
It's where the water damage from the phone comes from.
That's right. So it's just incredible. We're using up a valuable resource, which is our attention. In addition to that, we're giving up a valuable resource, which is this nature pre-installed mechanism of relaxing our nervous system as we transition between things. People who are very high functioning in life, I've noticed, are very good at transitioning between states. I've wondered somehow, I've got some colleagues who are phenomenal scientists, phenomenal parents, phenomenal athletes. There aren't many of these people, but they, you know, and it's incredible. Their power of attention is what they're doing, but they're also very good at pivoting between things. And I noticed that they don't tend to look at their phones as they pivot. They don't tend to be, they tend to disengage as they switch in order to re-engage. And I find that that's actually what I'm working on these days for myself. It's not just about getting engaged, it's about getting disengaged to be able to re-engage. And if from an athlete perspective, you'd say, of course, it's like no self-respecting athlete is gonna just train all the time. Rest and recovery are a fundamental part of their regimen. For people who use their mind, you know, entrepreneurs, academics, scientists, musicians, etc., creatives, you're like an athlete, you're a mental athlete. So you need to install those transitions. Recovery transitions. Yeah,
I love that. So I could go on for another hour. We just hit an hour.
Oh yeah, so it's always, I joke, it's always a danger to ask, so there are two questions you never want to ask a professor. One is, what do you do? And the second thing is, you never want to say, take as long as you need, because they'll just go on. So I apologize.
This is perfect, because like I just experienced you on stage, and we have different aspects here, and it's so helpful. I mean, for me it was helpful, and I don't care too much about what is anyone else thinking. I'm just asking the stuff I'm curious about,
well, I appreciate
and I'm
your question.
super straight and honest in these questions. But one thing I definitely always try to ask, or especially Michael, once my partner in podcast, always makes sure in asking is like, what's your source of inspiration? Is it reading? Is it something else? And if it's reading, what are your top recommended books, for example?
So two sources that may or may not surprise people. Animals. So I talked a little bit about this at the beginning, but I can spend hours watching animal behavior, and not in zoos. I'm not a big fan of large carnivores and stuff in zoos. It just kind of makes my heart sink. And no disrespect to the recovery of endangered species that zoos are doing, because they're doing great work. But I look at animal forms a lot. So there's a great Instagram, I don't know the guy at all, no relation to him, Joel Sartore, S-A-R-T-O-R-E. He has a project called, I think it's called the ARC project, where he's photographing as many species as he can to try and document them. And he takes these incredible photographs of them. I love their shapes. I love the way they move. I love their coloration patterns. I sometimes just go on YouTube and watch diving birds hunt, and or predators hunt. Or sometimes I love camouflage. I love thinking about the way that the nervous system and the body plan interact. And I think about it. I collect antique animal art, so my house has all these pictures that no one else cares about, but I love so much. So going into cities and looking for that stuff. So, because I think they have a lot of clues to offer about how the human brain is specialized and can work. So that's one major source of inspiration. I love all things William Wegman, the guy who dresses up the Weimaraner dogs, or Germany Weimaraner dogs. Brilliant guy. I love animals to the extent that it's almost pathologic, but whatever. So that's where I get a lot of inspiration, because it gives me and the inspiration is very specific. It's not science per se, but it gives me an emotional lift that makes me happy to be alive, and then I want to go work. And because there's days, I'm human, there are days I wake up and I'm like, I just feel like garbage. I don't feel like doing anything. There's days where I'm like, I could literally just sit here all day. I don't know what's wrong. And then I'll go watch a Wegman thing, or I have a bulldog named Costello. I'll interact with him a little bit, or I'll think about animals and kind of some of their quirks and behaviors, and I immediately want to go work. So that's one. And the other one's atypical for a scientist, I suppose, is music. I grew up on loud, fast music, and I'm not talking metal, and I'm not talking about garbage music. Like, I plug in the headphones and I just go back to that place where I'm 14, 15-year-old kid, and I'm pissed off, and I'm happy, and I'm like, and I've got like a little adventure in me, and I want to go out and like search and destroy, just
I can understand it.
And I just
it.
And it fills my nervous system, and I want to just go. And I feel like, and so both things, I'm just realizing, no one's ever asked me this question before, so I'm grateful for the question, because I'm learning from hearing my response that what I want is the thing that makes me like I love the hunt. Like, I love that feeling of like, I'm here for the short while on this planet. Like, let's go. If I have like 2 words that like are my mantra, it's let's go. I want the adventure, I want the hunt, and my hunt is science, and it's figuring out these tools that can help people help themselves. And so, yeah, I'll flip through my books of animals and look at the rhinoceros and be like, oh, he's got the biggest feet, or something trivial like that. And I'll, put in the headphones, listen to some old Stiff Little Fingers tracks or some Rancid, and I'm good. And then I put on my professor costume, I go to work, and I discover stuff.
I love that.
So
give me the last one. Some of our youngest listeners are around the age of 8, 9.
Oh, wow.
So that's how young
they are. So they won't know any of the music. That's okay.
So what would you like? Not many people have the privilege of this feeling you transported when you shared this morning with your dad, and he said, hey, do you know the feeling before your birthday? I mean, it's I could almost cry when you shared that. I could say, you know what, this is so good. What would you share with them?
Yeah, so 8 or 9, you're still well within the neuroplasticity window. You're good. You got a lot of good years ahead. So I would say, I really believe, and I don't have any scientific data to support this, but I really believe that we all have some superpower. This is why I love the X-Men, right? So I really believe that we all have some superpower that reflects, maybe this is a bit of a scientific explanation, that reflects the fact that our biology is tilted in some direction. People often think about their biology being tilted in a direction that doesn't serve them, like, oh, my parents were this, or or I'm not a good athlete, or I'm whatever. But it's also tilted in the direction of something really special. So like when I was a kid of that age, I was fascinated by animals. I was just like and so had I learned to listen to that more, I used to hide my interest in animals because I thought it was kind of it wasn't cool. Like, I didn't play the guitar in college, I didn't surf. I was like I can tell you all these facts about mustelids and ferrets. Like, what good is that? But but I think that kind of leaning, that kind of tilt towards like that's me. Like, you resonate with something. And I'm not the first to say this. I think Robert Greene also said this. Like, adults will often remember back to a time where they interacted with something. Sometimes it's an object, or sometimes it's an experience, and it just felt so good. Like it kind of drew you in. I would tell your young listeners and viewers to really pay attention to that. It can seem almost trivial, like it's rarely about the thing you're looking at or the thing you're doing, but sometimes it's the sensation of running. Sometimes it's the sensation of seeing something or hearing something, because there's a hint there, and it's not really about what you're looking at or you're doing. It's that feeling. Like, that feeling is your compass. Like, that's your true north. because that's the feeling you want to get to find, the mate for your life, the partner for your life, the career track. And over time, you're going to pivot, right? I mean, you're not going to get it on the first try. My story is science started there. It told me right there. I felt it in that conversation with my dad, and then my compass was all over the place and spinning, and eventually it's come back. I found it, but get in touch with that feeling. And if this seems at all abstract, I would do it as an experiment. I would sit in a chair and I would think about something you don't like really don't like, and I would pay attention to what that feels like in your mind and in your body. I'm not a very somatic person. I'm not somebody who feels stuff at the level of the body. I've always felt like my emotions were in my head. So when people talk about their emotions in their other places, I'm just I don't get it. But I would encourage them to think about that, and then I would encourage them to think about something they really like. It could be roller coasters, could be music, could be, get specific and to get in touch with that feeling. And that feeling is your guide.
Yeah.
That feeling is your compass, because the nervous system, it's not mystical. The nervous system will orient toward the things that it's best equipped to do. It really will. And animals do this naturally. My bulldog Costello never tries to be a different kind of dog. He never fetched once. First time I threw the ball, he walked to the ball, he sat down with the ball, he destroyed the ball, because that's what bulldogs do. Throw it to a retriever, they bring it back, because the brain of the retriever is wired to feel good by retrieving. Yeah. And the brain of the bulldog is good to feel good by being horizontal and pulling on things with they like to tug. So I think humans, we're similar enough, but we're different in the sense that you have something installed in you that feels right. And getting in touch with that feeling is key. And I should tell that you're not going to get it right away. This is a practice you learn, like shooting basketballs or math. You do it over and over but if you get started young at 8 or 9, oh my goodness, great. And if you do it when you're 12, or even if you're 60 and you do this, you'll find that pretty soon you start steering in these directions. And I do believe it's a nervous, it's a neural, there's a real physical substrate for this. It's not mysticism. So
Thank
do
you
it
so much.
And have fun. That's what I would tell them.
This was one of the best coincidences to get to know you today and yesterday and have this talk.
Oh, well, thank you. That's very gratifying. Thank you so much for the invitation and for your questions. They really stimulated and pushed me hard to think hard. So
thank you.
I really admire what you do, and I appreciate it.
So I encourage everyone to follow you on Instagram.
Yeah, at Huberman Lab, HUBERMANLAB. And
that's where you also share the breathing.
Yeah, I've got some tools there. I do every other day or so I put out a 1-minute neuroscience fact post, and I also refer to some interesting findings in high performance and in mental health, and you can reach me there through a direct message. And if you're in the San Francisco Bay Area and you want to be a subject in one of our experiments, great. And that's awesome. What I'm up to these days.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Cool.